So tell us about the Institute for Research on Teaching at Michigan State that you developed in 1976.
Well, we had been doing the research on medical problem solving, and that was really going very well. As I say, it was sort of changing the way that I looked at, what do we need to do in studies of teachers to get beyond the orientation of process product research, where basically you were sort of looking mechanistically at what teachers did and trying to understand its impact on student achievement. And as it happened, 1973, I left on a sabbatical for a year. I had a Guggenheim fellowship that year and came out to Stanford for the year. Lee Cronbach, the late Lee Cronbach, was my host and sponsor. The leading person on the study of teaching at Stanford at the time, a person who was in many ways David Berliner's mentor, was N.L. Gage, Nate Gage. And I had expected to be seeing a lot of Nate, even though I disagreed with nearly everything that Nate was doing. But Nate went to Washington to create a national effort to plan the next decade of research on teaching. And he sent to a number of people at Stanford, including me, the outline for the planning process. And I looked at it, and our mutual friend Dick Snow came in and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's garbage." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, it's nothing but a kind of testimony to the past. I mean, it's all the stuff that's going on now." And Nate doesn't realize that the field of psychology is undergoing a dramatic revolutionary change. The future is cognitive, not behavioristic. And the way we ought to be looking at teaching as acts of mind, as decision-making, as problem-solving. The only other person writing about that at the time was a Stanford graduate named Richard Shavelson, who had just recently graduated and was a good friend of Berliner's too. In any event, Snow persuaded me that Gage would listen if I wrote him a note about that. So I wrote him a long note arguing that that was a mistake. And he writes back, there was no email in those days. He writes back by almost return mail saying, "I think, you may be right. And so I'd like to devote one of the 10 panels of the planning process to this idea of teaching as information processing. And, but if you'll chair it." So I said, "Oh my God, I got a sabbatical. I'm trying to do some work." So I decided I had to. And so created this panel. It was part of the only one of the 10 panels that really had that orientation. And I got a bizarre set of people to join the panel. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, Tom Good, Philip Jackson. I mean, a wonderfully bizarre set of people, all of whom thought about teaching as involving acts of mind in some sense or another. And we submitted our report, and then we heard nothing. And then out of the blue comes an RFP from the feds, from the National Institute of Education, to create a new institute for research on teaching that would, in a sense, be the successor to the Stanford Center for Research and Development in Teaching, which had been here for 10 years. And we knew that Stanford would recompete and would assume that they could win. And in fact, some of our best friends, like David Berliner, who was then with Far West Lab, joined Stanford in this collaboration. They had 10 institutions working together in a collaboration. And we at Michigan State decided to go it alone and put a proposal together that was against the grain and argued for creating a national center for the study of teaching that would focus on the teacher as thinker, problem solver, planner. That would be very cognitive. And what we learned later was that there were 20 reviewers that reviewed all of the proposals, and we were named first on 19 out of the 20 proposals, in spite of the fact that we were only from Michigan State, not from Stanford and Harvard and those. But the ideas were better, and I think that, first of all, taught me that ideas trump. If it really matters if you go against the grain. And a year later, Judy Lanier, who was the director of teacher ed at Michigan State and an extraordinary teacher educator and talent, thinker, and I co-directed that institute, and it went on in its original form for 10 years, I mean, after I left for Stanford. And I think we helped shift the direction of research on teaching into the direction of teacher thinking, teacher knowledge, teacher conceptions, in ways that probably are now the dominant way of doing research on teaching.
Yeah, Bob Floden worked with you there as well.
He did, absolutely. He was one of the first people we hired.
And he says that has been, in his mind, that's your most significant contribution to the field to date.
More important than medical problems?
Yes. Different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
When speaking at AERA in 1985, he remembers that you criticized George Bernard Shaw, who said, "He who can does, and he who cannot teaches." What would be your version of this old adage?
Yeah, that was my presidential address to AERA. And I began with Shaw's very well-known statement and ended the talk with something like, "He who can does, he who understands teaches."
Oh, okay.
And that ended up on T-shirts in a variety of places, including, I think, at Arizona. Yeah, I mean, I think it did. It ended up really having that talk, which was 10 years after we began the Institute for Research on Teaching, and 3 years after I came to Stanford, kind of signaled another major shift in my work. And so that's a kind of crossroads too.
How do you think that we elevate the profession of teaching to a higher status?
We don't. I mean, there's not much we do. I mean, I think teachers do. I think that the problem teaching faces as a profession is that it looks so ordinary. And it's so familiar that it's almost like watching golf on television. You watch a golfer hit that golf ball, and it just looks so effortless, and you just don't have any idea of how complicated that swing is and how many thousands of hours of practice it takes to get that swing. And then you look at some of our great golf champions, and they hit periods of really bad golfing. I mean, Tiger's in that now, because they realize that something small has gone wrong with their swing, and they got to reconstruct it. And the teaching's like that too. That context changes, you change something, your kids change, and you've got to redesign that pedagogical swing. That it's not something you get right and it's fine forever. I mean, I've said, because I moved for a number of years back and forth between medical education and teacher education, and one of the things that I said, in fact, wrote in the volume honoring David Berliner's mentor, Nate Gage,
Sure.
that David and Barak Rosenshine edited, that the only time medicine is even remotely as difficult as the average day of a third grade teacher is in an emergency room during a natural disaster. Because physicians have this, surgeons have this enormous privilege of dealing with their patients one at a time. And it's not even one-on-one. Very often they've got help. And they don't have any classroom management problems, because the first thing they do is make you go into a cold room and take your clothes off. It's not exactly like you feel a sense of agency and empowerment. And then they come in with that white coat and that stethoscope, and the closet's filled with cold metal instruments that at a moment's notice they might decide to intrude upon you. And I mean, it's really a very different. A lot of medicine is very routine and quite straightforward. You come in with a rash. Well, if it's wet, make it dry, and if it's dry, make it moist. It's just, I don't want to trivialize medicine, but people are prepared to ascribe incredible complexity. They watch House too much to medicine. And they think that teaching is all about hanging out with the kids and telling them stuff. And they just don't appreciate its enormous complexity and richness. And you know, societies have been trying to elevate the status of teaching for a really long time. And I think teaching is, for the foreseeable future, going to be a profession enormously valued, but treated with less than the value it deserves. Mm-hmm. And that means economically, that means in status terms. You know, also professions that deal with the young, mm-hmm. with kids, are not treated with the same kind of regard as professions that deal with older people. Mm-hmm. I mean, just a whole bunch of stuff.
Sure.
But I think the work that we did on the national board is an example of something that raises the prestige, and because when people realize that the majority of people who sit for the boards don't pass the first time, mm-hmm. and they say, "Oh, gee, really?" You know, and so there's stuff that we can do, but it's an upward climb.
What are your perspectives about content and pedagogy and the relationship with both?
You know, I think that sometimes your biggest ideas are the ones that in retrospect elicit a kind of duh response. Mm-hmm. In about 1981 or 82, we were visiting, I think it was the University of Texas. There was a conference on teaching, and I think I was in transition to Stanford. And I gave a talk, and I called it The Missing Paradigm of Research on Teaching. And I asked the audience to try to before I began, to write down, to predict what I thought was the missing paradigm. Mm. And it was a talk that asked people to focus on the content of what was being taught. I said, we treat teaching as if it is domain independent, as if teaching is teaching is teaching. And even a lot of the work we did at the Institute for Research on Teaching was heavily cognitive, mm-hmm. but not focusing on the what of what was being taught. And that, you know, I was beginning to get this sense that the teaching of biology and the teaching of literature, the teaching of reading and the teaching of mathematics, these are enormously different. And that until we came to terms with that seriously in our research, that the research would sort of asymptote very early in terms of its effectiveness. And at the end of the talk at Texas, not a single person in the audience had anticipated that it was content. And that became the focus of my work as soon as I landed at Stanford, looking at the intersection of content and pedagogy. Out of that emerged this very rough and ready kind of set of distinctions mm-hmm. between teacher knowledge of content, teacher knowledge of pedagogy, and then there had to be something else. There had to be a domain which was neither and yet both. And out of that emerged, first hypothetically, the notion of what I think we first called content-specific pedagogy. Eventually, I guess I arrived at this almost unpronounceable pedagogical content knowledge, which thank God somebody began calling PCK, which is what it's called in Japan and a few other places, because who can say the rest of it? Mm. And the notion that what makes teaching special is that it has its own very unique domain of understanding and practice. And it's where principles of pedagogy and the range of content intersect. And that potentially every one of those intersections is a unique problem space. Mm-hmm. And so I found myself kind of driving the field to more and more content pedagogy particularism. And in order to do that, I kind of launched, as did a number of my colleagues and students, an all-out attack on general pedagogy, which was, methods courses were methods. And so, I'd say two things here. One is that I still believe strongly that the essence of great teaching is the pedagogical content knowledge, which you can't do without a great deal of content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge and experience. I didn't realize at the time how much my work in medicine presaged that, because what we learned, our biggest finding in medicine that Arthur Elstein and I, was that medical diagnosis is not generic. There are not good and poor diagnosticians. It's domain specific. You can be really good at the diagnostic of cardiovascular problems and suck with regard to the diagnosis of gastroenterological or neurological problems. And we were able to do that through our years of research and show how domain specific that was. And I didn't immediately transfer that to teaching. So that was really important. That drove a lot of the work. It's frankly the reason why there are more than 24 board assessments for the National Board, because that work that we then did on the National Board's creation flowed directly out of our work on teacher knowledge, which was pedagogical content knowledge dominated. So it had real consequences. In retrospect now that I'm older and wiser, I think that we overdid our attack on generic. In other words, there clearly are some aspects of teaching that involve generic practices that do cut across subject matter domains. And there are, the analogy I now use, let's say for teacher assessment, where I really attacked generic approaches to assessing teachers and want domain, how well does that person teach mathematics, say, is that if you look at evaluation, I think back at the deli. We got evaluated at the deli twice a year in Chicago, but not by the Michelin Guide, who never came close to the Shulman delicatessen, but by the Board of Health. And they used the same generic rating scale as they used at the fanciest French restaurant in the city, or at the burger joint down the street, or at our deli, or at the Chinese restaurant a block away. Because they weren't asking how good is the food here. They were asking, is it safe to eat here? Is this a safe place to eat? And so they could use a generic approach. And that was a very important question, because if it ain't safe, then I don't care if it's the French Laundry. I don't want to go there because I'm going to end up very sick. If you want to know the Michelin Guide's questions, and you're doing a French restaurant, then you better have a critic who knows French cuisine, who is capable of evaluating the nuances of differences in French cuisine, and also knows French wines, because that's what's being served to enhance the cuisine. You didn't need that to ask, is it safe to eat there?
Sure.
So my view is that generic approaches are asking, is it safe to eat here? Do these teachers have the capacity to manage classrooms, to develop relationships with kids of a generally positive sense? But it's not a way to ask, if this person's teaching the quadratic formula, how well are they doing it? So that's kind of where I am now.
And that's what the National Board and your work with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards.
Yeah.
During this time, you also became lifetime friends with David Berliner, who sounds like and looks like you in many ways, although David thinks that he's better looking. What do you have?
It's one of many errors that David has made over the years.
Yes. What you do have in common also is your food and your food metaphors that you use quite often in your research. What are agreebanes, and what is your shared theory about their impact on your arterial system?
First of all, they're gribinous,
Oh, there
not
we go.
greebanes.
That would be my...
That would, yeah, well, Well, these are what some of our friends in the South call cracklings. You start with the rendering of chicken fat, which is absolutely necessary
Okay.
for any reasonable cuisine, and then you put little pieces of the chicken skin and onions and what have you into the rendered chicken fat, and you fry them until they get very crisp.
Sounds healthy.
That was never the point. That was never the point. It was one of those aspects of cuisine that Judy liberated me from after we got married, except, in my case, and I think Berliner's, the way you cheat on your wife is to go eat gribbenes when she's not looking. What is their impact on the circulatory system? Well, the one theory that Berliner and I share is that, contrary to most medical mythology, they do not lead to a hardening of the arteries, but instead that the chicken fat and gribbenes act as a kind of vascular Teflon, and they line the arteries so that the blood goes whoosh all the way through. That's our theory. That's our theory.